some experience on both sides of the FOI. I was a reporter for television stations for 14 years, the most recent at KARK. I spent 7 years there. And in 2010, I started working for the state, first for ADUQ as a public information officer, and I'm currently the communications officer for the House of Representatives. So I'm very happy to be here today, and let me introduce our panelists, starting with Tom Carpenter, who's right to my left. Tom is the city attorney for Little Rock. He has been in that position since 1991 and was an assistant city attorney beginning in 1984. His private practice with Lessenberry and Carpenter was primarily criminal defense work, and he has handled a number of capital cases at trial, appeal, and he was a member of an Arkansas Bar Association committee on cameras in the courtroom in 1979, later argued before the Arkansas Supreme Court for the modification of Arkansas rules to allow cameras in the courtroom. He has lectured several times on the FOI to law students, lawyer groups, and other professional groups impacted by the act. He has also written on the topic, including the article, Who You Want What? Access to Government Litigation Files Under FOI, and that's been published in the Arkansas Lawyer magazine. He is a 1974 graduate of Hendrix College. He attended law school at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, and received his degree in 1977. After clerking for Justice Darrell Hickman of the Arkansas Supreme Court, he began his law practice in Little Rock. Thank you for being with us today, Tom. And in the middle, we have Bill Sadler. Bill Sadler is a native of Rison. He grew up in a weekly newspaper family who published the Cleveland County Herald. In 1967, Bill's father, then editor of the weekly newspaper, was among the Arkansas Press Association officers who worked to craft and lobby for the passage of the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act. Bill devoted 26 years of his professional career as both a reporter and editor. Following a 3-year stint with the Jonesboro Sun, he moved into broadcast news as a reporter for KARK and later served as managing editor prior to leaving the news business 17 years ago. In 1997, Bill was employed as a public information officer for the Arkansas State Police. In addition to his daily duties handling public inquiries directed to the department, he is also responsible for handling all FOI requests directed to the department. Thank you, Bill Sadler, for being here today. And last but not least, Eric Francis, and I've had the pleasure of working with Eric directly at the House. It's always a pleasure, and he has graciously agreed to appear this afternoon. He is a freelance journalist, and he has been working as a freelance journalist for the last 6 years. He has been a journalist for 24 years, most recently before he freelanced with the North Little Rock Times. He is an Arkansas native and currently living in North Little Rock. Thank you, Eric, for being here today. The first question I wanted to ask, I wanted to direct to Tom and Bill, and then I'll subsequently follow up with Eric, and that is what advice each of you would give to government agencies, particularly with those with limited resources and staff, when it comes to handling an enormous amount of information for an FOI request. And I'm certain as the city and state police, you've probably been handed some of those FOI requests like Chad was speaking about, where there's an enormous volume and you have 3 days to do so. What kind of advice would you offer?
Well, the first thing, this works. This broadcast experience works. Okay.
There you go.
The first thing, if you get one of those, is to recognize that foul words suggesting that the man has an Oedipus complex or whatever it is really do not help. And usually what has happened is that somebody is trying to get something, they're afraid for you to know exactly what they're trying to get, so they ask for the moon. And if you let them know the details and how problematic that is, they will normally help you to narrow or tailor the FOI request to something that's much more manageable. Once that is done, if they're going to do it, then what you need to do is let them know, I've got to get this to you in 3 days. I can't possibly get this to you in 3 days. I think I can get it to you in whatever you think is a reasonable period of time. Never, not a good period of time. The Arkansas Supreme Court has not ever accepted never. But normally I've found if it's a week or 2 weeks or sometimes even longer, that's fine. Now, this is assuming we're talking about records that can be accessed without having to develop special programs to get this stuff off of a computer system. If those two things don't work, or even if they do work, I think it's important for you to get a letter out to the individual that notes the problem, notes that you've had the conversation. That needs to be done, I would say, immediately and definitely within that 3-day period of time. If you can set a reasonable time frame for when you think you can get it out, state that in there. We have never had to do it, but what we would do is file a declaratory judgment action under the Act in Circuit Court and say, look, we can't answer this within 3 days for these reasons. Now, before you say that, make sure that you can't answer that within 3 days. And that doesn't mean that, you know, some people aren't going to be inconvenienced somewhat, but it does mean, you know, you're not taking on massive overtime expenses and so forth. If it's a matter that deals with computer data, and it's going to require the writing of a special program to capture the data, the FOI tells you that your agency can charge the reasonable cost for capturing that data with 3 free hours of the lowest paid person who can capture that data without ruining the entire system. Not really being able to turn on my cell phone very well, I can't tell you what that means, but your IT people can, and you need to get them to be straightforward with you. And I think if you do those things, I think you're probably going to be okay. Most of the time, as I said, people will ask a really broad question. I need all of the criminal records for 1011 North Bryan in Little Rock, period. And now they've asked for how long you've got criminal records, and some places have them for a much longer period of time. And you say, well, can you give me a little bit of a better thing? And they'll usually say, well, I really need to know between January and March. And that's really not so hard to deal with. So if you'll try that, most people have been pretty cooperative.
And Bill, did you want to add anything to that?
Nothing really, especially you know, that Tom hasn't already said, but I would, I'm sure we've got some people out here from some of the smaller communities, so don't feel alone. When I came to the state police in 1997, I can probably count on one hand the number of computers that were in that headquarters building. And even today, we still have a huge number of paper records. So that's no excuse to say, you know, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to try to at least say, well, here are the records, and then if we have some redactions that have to be done, we'll try to do, as Tom said, establish that line of communication, but using all of the tools that we've been told about in the previous presentation. Hey, go through the stepping stones. You know, is it a public record? What's in that public record? Does it meet any of the exemptions? So it's to your advantage, I think, to always have that line of communication with the person asking the question. I can't tell you how many times I've received an FOI that is just, you think, oh my gosh, they're asking for the moon here. But when you talk to them and say, you know, can you give me some idea of what you're looking for? They'll tell you. And it's just because they thought they had to shotgun it and to get what they were looking for, when if they had just told me, well, we could have gone right to it and picked it out of the box of 1989 records that are in the attic. So again, that line of communication is very important.
And Eric, I'll alter the question a little bit from your perspective. We have all seen reductions in staff in media statewide, layoffs and mergers, so there is an increasing pressure on reporters to get their stories in by deadline. They're doing the work of what used to be 2 or 3 people, now it's them solely. So taking all of that into consideration, how has the FOI helped you to be more efficient, if at all, or what recommendations would you give to reporters when now in this current environment, when they have to exercise the use of the Freedom of Information Act?
One of the things that makes the FOI a productivity tool for journalists is the fact there is the statutory 3-day deadline. And that helps you make sure that you're not going to be stonewalled by a reluctant public agency or public official, because they will recognize when you show that to them that they have that deadline to meet. At the same time, exactly as both the gentlemen on my right have said, it's possible to ask for too much at one time. And I think one of the things having access to the Freedom of Information Act does for a reporter is it can help them learn how to hone their requests. And when you have cooperative public officials who are looking to maximize the best use of their time as well, it's actually a good collaborative tool. When I first started as a journalist in Arkansas back in 1990, I'm sure any FOI requests I made were effectively the shotgun kind of requests, because I was a rookie reporter and didn't understand the more subtle nature of the effectiveness of the FOI. And now, what I try to teach interns and younger reporters when I was working in a newsroom, I recognize that we're far better off using the Freedom of Information Act as a carrot than a stick. And while there are certainly projects like what Chad Day was just talking about that will require access to massive amounts of public information, those aren't the kind of projects where you ask for that information 3 days before you want to use it. And you as a journalist need to recognize that, because that's going to make your job a lot easier, because these gentlemen won't then rebel against you because you want 5,000 pages of information in 72 hours. So I think you have to look at the FOI and ask yourself not just how can I use this to get the information I need, how can I use this most effectively to get the information I need?
I like that answer, because I think when I started out, when I was making my first few requests, I was very skeptical of the person on the other end. I wanted it to be broad-reaching, because I didn't want them to know what my story was working on. Now, on the other side of it, we're not all out to get reporters or trap them, but that kind of leads me into my next question, is that coming from both sides of this issue, when an individual is looking for a particular set of data and they are using the wrong terminology, there can be frustration on both ends of that. The agency may work extensively to provide them for that. They'll look through it and say, this is not what at all I was using, what I was looking for. So how do reporters and the public avoid confusion with agencies when making requests? Should they just pick up the phone and say, I'm looking for XYZ, tell me exactly what I need to be putting in this request? And I'd like to hear it from both sides.
I would say yes. You're better off starting out asking specifically for what you want. And if you are unclear on what you want, sit down with someone from the agency and say, this is what I'm trying to get at here. What kind of records do you have that apply to that? As a journalist, I recognize that I am frequently in a somewhat adversarial relationship with the custodians of public records. But that does not mean that it has to be a confrontational relationship. You can make a lot of your future interactions with public officials and agencies easier if you make well thought out, reasonable requests. That does not mean, as a journalist or as a member of the public, you have to compromise on what it is you're trying to get, what information you're trying to lay your hands on. But I think you'll find that if you worry less about the motives or the motivations of the people you're requesting from, and worry more about how do I get what I need to accomplish my story or my project, you'll find that the process moves a lot more smoothly.
And do Bill or Tom, do you want to add to that?
I want to give you an example at state police, and it points to a problem sometimes that I hate to say this. I'm over 60 now, and so it's some of the younger reporters do not necessarily know the mechanics of state government as well as some of the older reporters. And for instance I'm going to give you is that and I think it was 1995, the General Assembly moved a portion of the Department of Human Services Central Registry under the auspices of the Arkansas State Police. It's called the Hotline. All the records and what, it's a common question, and an FOI even. I've been told the state police is investigating this, and you pretty well pick up early on it has something to do with a child, and right there we hit one of those particular statutes that is outside the scope of FOI, because the Central Registry is statutorily exempt, and I can't disclose what is playing out in that Central Registry on a child maltreatment or child abuse case. So sometimes if again, it's, you know, people say, well, I'm going to send you this FOI. Hey, I'd rather hear from you by telephone or drop by or whatever, because at that point in time, that line of communication gets established. And just tell me what it is you're looking for.
Yeah, I think Bill hit the nail on the head. The Democrat Gazette, since the days of Danny Shamir, is merely a reporter. Before he was an editor, and since then has done an excellent job with city government of making sure that we know who the new reporter is that's covering City Hall. And I try to let them all know, you know, it's okay to call me when you don't understand what happened. If it's okay for me to use foul language or bad syntax, and you not quote that. And I'm pretty good about saying what is and isn't on the record and what's off the record. That's not for FOI information, that's just for how do things work. The fact of the matter is that FOI problems that we have are almost never with the news media. They are with individuals who are looking for information. And we don't have as much contact with them that way. I will tell you that if you are a member of the news media and you've made my life difficult, and the time that I said a foul word in a crowded theater, you put it on the air, then I'm probably not going to be very helpful in helping you work down your particular request. On the other hand, if I can say, okay, let me just talk for a minute, and then you can ask questions on the record, and you say that's fine, then I'm probably going to do everything I can to help you. I think that the government employees that are here, and the comment I always like to make, nobody has forced me to be a government employee. Nobody has forced me to be the city attorney. And so if I'm going to take that job, and if I'm going to take that job in Arkansas particularly, then I know that FOI is not only a requirement, but it has been stated by our legislature, by our governors, and by our Supreme Court. You know, this is something we really cherish. It's about the only place in the Arkansas Code that uses the word liberal anymore. And so, you know, that's the standard that we want to meet, and we want to try to help you, not only because that's what we do, but because it doesn't do us any good for you to write a story or for somebody to make an allegation against government on the wrong information. And so I think the thing I guess I'm really saying is, make those phone calls in between if you're a member of the media or if you're asking for information, to let us know what you don't understand, and then listen to us when we try to explain it.
Cecily, let me follow up on something, because Tom brought to mind a situation that arose just last week. And not to say that the Democrat always does it correctly, but there was a call late last Thursday afternoon from a reporter, one of the senior reporters. And he asked for a record, and not one time did he say, hey, under FOIA, I'm asking for this. He just asked for the record. In practicality, that made my life just a little bit easier, because on an FOI, I'm going to be obligated to at least document, even if it came in by telephone verbally, I still need to document that, okay, I'm doing this today, I'm doing this tomorrow, I'm beginning the redaction process. I'm going to keep a record of what I'm doing toward meeting the objectives of the FOI. And this reporter just said, hey, I need this particular record. And yeah, it was kind of a shocker for a moment, but we got it to him, I think, the next morning.
I will say, if a government employee says something to the effect of, now you're asking for this under FOI, aren't you? That what they are really saying is, my ass is in a crack and I'm going to get criticized or fired unless I had to give this over. Please send me an email. That's what they're really saying.
I agree. And I hope I wasn't that reporter who broadcast you saying a bad word.
And if I can just jump in here for a second, the law itself does not mandate a written request.
No.
In practice,
That's right.
Over the years, I have found that a written request is frequently a good thing to follow up with. Call first, talk to them, tell them what you're looking for, because it does establish a paper trail, and that's something that helps both sides of the equation be accountable.
That's good advice. The state recently, for those who may not know, this was maybe 3 years ago, started the online checkbook, and now all state salaries are online at transparency.arkansas.gov. All expenditures for vendors can be found there as well. And to that end, I wanted to ask Tom and Bill how the next session is going to be about technology, so I don't want to step on toes too much on that panel. But in your experience, how has the website, how has the internet changed how you operate with the FOI? And I know, Bill, what was changed my life a few years ago as a reporter was when state police started putting all the traffic reports online. I didn't have to call you every day looking for this accident or that one. I knew exactly where to find it. Has it made your life easier or harder?
The FOI was written in 1967, essentially. There were been a couple of amendments to it. There have been several amendments to it, actually. One of the odd things about term limits is that the legislature doesn't seem to be as bothered about amending FOI as they did before, but essentially it hasn't changed, and it's not geared towards the digital age. And there was a question in the last panel that I'm just going to give you, this is a segue into digital stuff. We got a request for all police videos between a date in March and a date in April of this year. Now, you break it down, it's essentially 30 days, and you think, well, you know, that's not that bad. But then when you realize that some police videos are running 8 hours a day, or 8 hours a shift, 24 hours a day, and that there are 40 cars, then suddenly you're looking at 10 to 20,000 hours worth of tape. And on that tape, it's going to be juvenile information, social security numbers, and driver's license numbers, which are protected by federal law, NCIC and ACIC reports, which are protected by federal law, and all of that has to be redacted. And while we've got the software to be able to redact it from the tape, somebody's going to have to sit down who has the authority to get that information and be the one to redact it. So there's something like 2,000 hours in a year or something like that. It's, I think, what is a work year. It's a little bit more than that. That means that you have 10 people doing nothing for a year to answer a request that has to be answered in 3 days. In that sense, FOI, I think, needs to look at what's going on. To make my little scenario worse, the new police car is in Little Rock, so don't get stopped in Little Rock because we have 3 cameras on you. We have one pointing in the front, one pointing in the back, we have another one someplace else, and if you act up and get tased, we've got one in the taser. So that's 4 cameras, which multiplies again the number of hours of information that you're asking for. And that's the mother lode question we've gotten, and we're trying to get something worked out on it. In terms of the internet, the FOI is not clear that we can simply say, go to the city's website, it's under documents. I take the position that it doesn't matter that it's under documents and that it's there, that if we can say, John, you can go to the internet and do this, and if he says, I want you to send me a copy of it, then I think we still have an obligation to send a copy of it. In terms of the salary aspect of it, I like the fact that the city is essentially doing what the state has done, only because I don't have to have the conversation every year. Well, now, do we have to send out 3,000 letters to city employees to let them know that somebody has requested personnel information? and that we think it's clearly something to be turned over. I once sent an AG's request and said, everybody knows that my salary and any city employee's salary is a public record. Do we really have to go through the exercise as a personnel record of notifying the employee? Can't we just give them salary information, since that's just not a question? And the answer we got back was, no, you still have to go through that. Well, if you're in Rising and maybe have 12 public employees, that's not that hard to do. If you're in Little Rock and you have a couple of thousand employees, plus the time frame on the FOI could conceivably take on another 200 to 300 or 400 retired employees, it is a major problem to get done within a short period of time. And so I think that to the extent that the internet and computers have all helped in being able to capture information, I think the FOI itself has created some real problems in the digital age that have not been addressed.
The only thing I would add is that the electronic checkbook has, I've noticed a marked decrease in the number of these Friday afternoon emails from Department of Finance Administration, OPM office, saying, hey, we've got this request for, salaries, positions, and whatever else might be associated with the request. And the law says that if we can't make contact immediately with that employee, there's this language of 1967 that you have to use, quote, overnight mail. Well, why not an email? And we've stretched that limit a little bit. We've gone to the email route of making employees notified, or fulfilling that obligation to let them know there's been a request. But the electronic checkbook, I think, has given a huge dent in those types of requests. But like Tom says, if they ask for the record, you still got to come up with it.
And Eric, we have one more minute. Are there any sites you would recommend to the public? Is there something you use on a regular basis that helps you find information that you need? Does anything come to mind?
Actually, I find that the best approach is still to talk to the people from whom you want information. And I think, in my view, the actual problem with technology in the FOI is more along the lines that government doesn't keep up with technology and software and all of that the way the private sector does. And so there are people out there who work in the computer industry and the technology industry who know that you can get this kind of information out of this kind of database with this simple program, but if the agency doesn't have that program, or they're not up on the latest bleeding edge technology and programming methods, that's not going to make much of a difference. So I would say always start out with the people from whom you want to get information. Take advantage of the online state checkbook and any other online databases you have, but for me still, it's the personal interaction is where you're going to have the most effective use of your time and effort when trying to acquire public documents.
This went by much more quickly than I anticipated. Thank you all for being here, and thank you.
As our next panel comes up, just keep in